Hi, good afternoon. So in the United Methodist Church, when you're ordained for what's called representative ministry. And that means I represent Karen and Brenda and all the people of First United Methodist Church. Often people ask me to speak, but it's really on behalf of this group called the Allies for Peace with Justice in Palestine. And we got started a couple of years ago by going to Palestine, 10 of us, part of a larger group. We're going again next October. Anybody want to go with us? Tell Brenda, and because we would love to have you. Now I have a question for you. Have you ever met somebody and wished you'd met them 2 or 3 decades earlier? Today I met just that kind of person, Rabbi Arik Ascherman, and he graduated from Harvard 1981, and from 81 to 83 he worked for Interns for Peace, a community work program in which Israeli Jews and Arabs, as well as Jews from around the world, work together to bring Israeli Jews and Arabs together in positive interaction. He's been doing this work for a long time. When he was at Hebrew University, he set up a student-faculty soup kitchen and worked on issues of advocacy for the homeless. And those of us in Boulder know that as a community, those communities of faith are working hard to acknowledge that homeless persons were made in the image of God and deserve food and place and shelter. He was the co-director of Rabbis for Human Rights beginning in 1995, and was the executive director from 1998 to 2010. He's currently as president and senior rabbi. He's internationally recognized as a leading advocate for human rights and social justice, and I like this, has stood trial for acts of civil disobedience. Amen. That's how the world gets changed, in my opinion. He's received a lot of awards: the Abraham Joshua Heschel Award for Jewish Peace Fellowship, Humanitarian Achievement Prize by the Holistic Peace Institute, 2009 the Keter Shem Tov Prize awarded by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and the 2011 Gandhi Peace Prize for promoting enduring peace, along with Rabbi Ehud Bandel on behalf of the Rabbis for Human Rights. And his partner is Dr. Einat Ramon, and they have 2 children. And as I say, whenever all of you come here, and you should be coming here even more, because can you feel the justice building in this room? As a place from which we can all go and work together to change the world. But I am really blessed today to be able, on behalf of all of you, to welcome Rabbi.
Thank you all. It's nice to be here. Actually, our greeting, because today is the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks would be Chag Sameach, and what we've basically been doing is celebrating the fact that after having left Egypt 50 days ago, we've arrived at Mount Sinai, and when you talk about going forth from here, we've been trying to trudge to the desert day after day after day with our eyes focused on the mountain and trying to remember what things are supposed to be about. And so, in 2008, we in Israel celebrated which anniversary?
60 years.
60th, right? Now this, of course, was a time of great celebration for us as Israelis. A time to give thanks for the fact that after 2,000 years of oppression, because we were stateless and homeless, we again had some control of our own destiny. And of course, we also know that what for us is a cause of great celebration is for others the Nakba, the great disaster. So I could condense my usual 5-hour talk simply by saying that our goal in Rabbis for Human Rights vis-a-vis Palestinians, and as you're going to hear, that's only one piece of what we do, is to bring a little bit closer to reality that promise that God makes time and time again in the book of Genesis, that through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. If today we're kind of in a zero-sum game, what's a blessing for us is a curse for others, we want to get to a win-win situation, which a blessing for us is a blessing shared by all. Now, on the occasion of this anniversary, we issued a series of 2 radio ads, each of them starting with a piece of the original recording of our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, reading out in 1948 our Declaration of Independence. And in the first version of these radio ads, you hear him say the country will be mushtetet, the very foundation of its existence will be cherut, tzedek v'shalom, freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. And in the second, you hear him say that the country will guarantee total social and political equality for all, regardless of religion, nationality, or gender. And our ads went on to say, we had this dream. We had this dream 67 years ago. Not what the rest of the world was asking of us, what we were asking of ourselves, what we thought we were coming here to do, to build, to create. And we asked the question, where have we succeeded? And where have we not yet succeeded? We didn't say where we failed. Because 60 or even 67 years is not a long time as countries go. But when we're being honest with ourselves, and that's not an easy thing to do, I'll be honest, that we in the Jewish community, so aware that there are many people around us who don't have Israel's best interests at heart, even when we're in our most intimate circles, sometimes it's very difficult to talk honestly about any concerns we have. It's kind of like saying the word cancer. You're afraid you might get it. And so it's very difficult, even when we're talking among ourselves, to whisper any things that we think aren't quite what our own dream was. But when we're being honest with ourselves, for all the wonderful and amazing things that we've done in such a short amount of time in Israel, and we haven't lived up to our own dream, not yet, in terms of the field of human rights. Now here we are in a church. We have many faith-based groups that have co-sponsored this event. Some of you perhaps read the Bible once in a while. And you might be asking yourselves, and if you haven't, you should, well, what did the prophets have to say about freedom, justice, and peace? Do they all agree with each other? We like to quote the prophet Isaiah about beating swords into plowshares. And we tend to kind of forget about the prophet Joel, who talked about beating plowshares into swords. All right? One of the most, and this brings up the fact that, on the one hand, if anyone says to you, Judaism says, a big red warning light has to go off in your head. Our religion is simply too ancient, multi-layered, and based on debate to say that about almost anything. But that also means that, in our part of the world, where, in our part of the world, religion is not simply something that you go to church or synagogue or mosque or temple once a week. It really is, for many people, the thing that drives everything they do from the moment they get up in the morning to the time they go to sleep at night. I'm a little bit mixed up between night and day because one of the Shavuot traditions is to stay up all night, which we all did last night, studying Torah. So we're a little bit off cycle. But in any case, it means that we're here in our part of the world where these questions and these principles are the things that are driving forces. We can't even necessarily agree what our own religion has to say about these burning moral issues that we're facing. And one of the most amazing video clips I have was from a few years back, and I'm out with a television crew from ABC Australia, and we catch 2 Israelis in the act of stealing olives from Palestinian trees. We call the police, they're on their way, and as they're packing up, this surreal, bizarre discussion unfolds. I'm wearing a kippah, they're wearing kippot, we're all religious Jews. And so we get into this seemingly esoteric discussion about what the Jewish tradition has to say about the property rights of non-Jews in the biblical land of Israel. Except for it's not so esoteric because what I just said, that these are values that really drive what people do every minute of the day. Let's just say it wasn't the most productive discussion. Nobody was listening to each other all that carefully. And at one point, in a rather mocking way, one of them says to me, "Well, you must be reading from a warped Torah scroll." And I must admit that I more or less descended to their level, and I answered in kind of, "No, I think you're right. I think I am reading from a different Torah scroll than you are. Mine has things that seem to be missing from yours, like don't steal, don't trespass." So the point is that if our first mandate in rabbis for human rights is to try to prevent or redress human rights abuses, then our second and no less important mandate is to try to introduce into the intellectual universe of our fellow Israelis another way of understanding our own tradition, very different than the one that's become very dominant in Israel today. The way I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, it was simply assumed that a basic part of what it means to be a Jew, as I'm sure that many of you feel about your faith traditions, is to be concerned about universal human rights and social justice. This is what I learned from my parents, from my rabbis, from my teachers, from my community. And now I'll date myself a little bit. When I first spent time in Israel, I had a little bit more red hair in my beard than I do today. And my first greatest shock was to find out that bagels were not readily available. What kind of Jewish state is this if you can't get bagels? But my more profound shock was when I found that these values, which are so axiomatic that I never would have thought of questioning them, were not necessarily shared by all Israelis, particularly religious Israelis. Okay? First of all, I should say, in many ways, Israel is a very democratic country. In fact, if I put the 300-pound gorilla of the occupation aside for just a second, in many ways, it's a more democratic country than the United States. Okay? That may be true, but for example, we have a much wider range of opinions regularly expressed in the mainstream, let alone the alternative press, than you would ever find in this country. Or if you think about the fact, what did the last presidential elections cost?
Yeah.
Okay. So in Israel, there were a few less parties running this last election because they raised the election threshold. But over the years, we've sometimes had 30 or 40 parties running. That's just a mess. But big parties, small parties, Jewish parties, Arab parties, Zionist, non-Zionist, religious, secular, everything you can imagine. Small parties that had no chance ever of getting into the Knesset. Some of my favorites over the years have been the Men's Rights Party and the Taxi Drivers Party. All of them getting state-funded radio and television time to get their opinions across. And again, if you think about that connection between money and access and power in this country, that's one of the things that makes, in many ways, Israel a very democratic country. And we are split right down the middle on many of the major issues that we face as a society. Okay? There are many Israelis who actually support many of the things that we support and believe in, although not enough of them act on that. Most of them are secular. Whereas in the religious community, for a variety of historical and sociological reasons, that community, unfortunately, and it's painful for me to say this as a rabbi, but statistically, is much more likely to be racist, much more likely to be opposed to human rights. One of our founding rabbis, his daughter went to B'nai Akiva, one of the Orthodox youth movements, and she met her husband-to-be when there was a slightly liberal speaker, and they were the only two people that clapped their hands at the end. That's how they met each other. So anyone who's looking, that's a piece of free advice. But the point is, that is part of the socialization going on in our society. Rabbis for Human Rights was founded during the first Intifada back in 1988 by Rabbi David Foreman, who wrote, at the time, there was actually much more sympathy among average Israelis for Palestinians during the first Intifada than, let's say, the second Intifada. There wasn't the same level of violence, there wasn't the same level of terror, and many average Israelis weren't particularly left-wing or political or activists, simply felt that moral red lines have been crossed. And many of Israel's current human rights organizations were all founded about that same time. Ourselves, B'Tselem, Physicians for Human Rights, Workers' Hotline, and many others were all founded about that time. And our founder, Rabbi Foreman, wrote an open letter to the chief rabbinate saying, why is it that the religious establishment in this country seems only concerned about Sabbath observance and kashrut, our Jewish dietary laws. As important as these things are, where are the Abraham Joshua Heschels running around this country and crying Gewalt and speaking to some of the burning moral issues of our society? Rabbi Heschel was a descendant of a long line of Hasidic rabbis, saved from the Holocaust, spent most of his career in this country, wrote amazing books, which I highly recommend, on Jewish philosophy, on poetry, biographies, but he didn't just write books. He didn't just stay in the ivory tower. He's one of the first people to speak out about the Jews of the former Soviet Union. Behind the scenes, he was one of the people that led to Nostra Aetate, the clauses in Vatican II, which led to some rapprochement between the Jewish and Catholic communities worldwide. He was very active in the struggle against the Vietnam War. One of the founders of Clergy and Laity Concerned, very involved in a lot of ecumenical work. A very good friend of Dr. King's. And in fact, his picture hangs on our wall, marching with Martin Luther King at Selma. Although he wasn't in the film, but he was there, in the front row, I promise you, along with another rabbi, Maurice Eisendrath. And this meant a need, as I said, that many rabbis were feeling. And we quickly became, to this day, we're about 120 rabbis. We are the only rabbinic organization explicitly dedicated to human rights, and the only one in which Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and Renewal rabbis all coexist in one organization without strangling each other. So just for that, we should get some brownie points somewhere. Thank you. And in fact, it was so unusual at the time that all we had to do was show up someplace where human rights abuse had taken place, and all the press would show up, because it was kind of like man bites dog. And it's not so simple anymore. But over the years, we've received the Speaker of the Knesset's prize for our contributions to Israeli society. And we've been endorsed in this country by the rabbinic bodies of the Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and Renewal movements. And at home, I like to say that we're at the human rights table. If we've been really successful, we'd be out of business by now. I mean, that's our goal. We want to be not needed anymore. But we do work every day with government ministers and members of Knesset and the press and the international community and the people that are making public policy and shaping opinion. We work sometimes through the courts, sometimes through direct action, sometimes through media and public campaigns, sometimes by lobbying our government and our Knesset, and yes, sometimes through acts of civil disobedience. And I myself have stood on trial, for example, for standing in front of bulldozers that had come to demolish Palestinian homes, not because of any security reason, but because of a catch-22 situation in which you can be a Palestinian, have a clean security record, uncontested title to your land, you can stand on your head. And in most cases, you will not be able to get a legal building permit because of an intentional manipulation of building and zoning laws to make that almost impossible. And then when you build without a permit, your home is subject to demolition. Now, I said a few minutes ago that Israel is a very strong democracy, and I meant that. And in democracy, you can't just do civil disobedience every time you disagree with something, because that would be chaos. But as Rabbi Heschel would say so often, in democracy, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. So seeing that bulldozer tearing into that home, and the father of the household clutching at his heart, he's about to have a heart attack. The women pulling at their hair, pleading with us to do something. And knowing the worst is yet to come, the moment I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, and that's the moment the children come home. They went off in the morning and they are home, and now there's rubble. And so it's those moments where I feel that that Torah that I, as a rabbi, am sworn to uphold is being ground into the rubble along with that home. And that image of God that we're all supposed to be honoring is being banished from that place. And those are the moments when one has no choice but to stand in front of the bulldozers. So there were some amazing moments when I was on trial. First of all, I've already mentioned that it is very difficult, particularly for Jewish leaders abroad, as concerned as we are about people twisting our words in ways that we did not intend, to say anything when they have concerns about some of what is happening in Israel. And so the fact that we had over 400 rabbis that signed an open letter to our prime minister about the home demolition issue was very meaningful. Recently we had some 800 rabbis on a letter about the Bedouin. And then it turned out that the day that I would take the stand on my own behalf fell between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. This is one of the holiest times in our Jewish calendar. And as I said to the judge, from the moment that I knew that this was the day that I would take the stand, what kept on ringing through my head are the words we say just before our Kol Nidrei prayer on Yom Kippur, where we say, B'yeshiva shel mala, b'yeshiva shel mata. In the heavenly court above and the earthly court below, we can all pray together on this most holy of eves. I said to the judge, in a few days it's going to be Yom Kippur. And because we believe that every single human soul on this planet is being judged on that day, we ask of God in the Yeshiva Shemada, in the heavenly court, to move and not judge us while sitting on the throne of strict justice, but rather to move to the throne of mercy and compassion. How can we ask God of God in the Yeshiva Shemada, in the Yeshivot Shemata, if in the earthly courts and institutions in which we are responsible both for justice and for mercy, if we don't do the same? And I reminded the judge that in the Bible, in the original Hebrew, justice and law are synonyms. Tzedakah mishpat. Unfortunately, I don't know how many lawyers or judges we have here, but I think most of us know that's not always the case in our world. But I had the prosecuting attorney in tears that day, but the judge remained rather aloof, and she was the one that counted. We don't have jury trials in Israel. But we were then convicted and then unconvicted when the prosecution said we were upstanding citizens and that it should be expunged for community service. All my friends thought I should do community service by rebuilding Palestinian homes, but the judge didn't go for that either. But having not received justice in a court of law, our first act was to lay the cornerstone for rebuilding one of those homes, which we did with help from rabbis from around the world, including Rabbi Firestone from here, from Boulder. And for a year I could have taken you to visit that family in their home again. That they have the dignity of living in a home. I would have shown you the housewarming gift that we brought for the family. A grapevine and a fig tree. In the words of the prophet Micha, that every person should sit under their vine and under their fig tree, that none shall make them afraid. That's what we want for every human being. That no Israeli should live in fear of terror. And that no Palestinian should live in fear of having their homes arbitrarily demolished. The home was demolished again a year later. We rebuilt it. It's standing now. We did it more quietly. But we don't just do this endless cycle of rebuild and demolish and redemolish and rebuild. In what may be a Guinness Book of World Records, for the longest Israeli high court case in the making, we realized back when I was on trial that we weren't going to stop this policy simply by myself and others standing in front of bulldozers. That we had to get to the heart of the issue. And we had to use the tools of Israel's democracy to try to change this policy. And so, we have petitioned Israel's High Court to return zoning and planning authority for Palestinian communities to Palestinian hands. And right now we're waiting for the judges to decide. On the one hand, they've said that they don't want to push the government too far. And on the other hand, they were clearly disturbed about the discrimination of two different planning and zoning systems, one for settlers and one for Palestinians. Yeah, they're going to demolish the church now? Or there's this Israeli movie about this guy that just decides to build like a tunnel or something from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. And
She's going to stand in front of him.
okay. In any case, and they gave the state 90 days to come up with an alternative, something to improve the situation. The government, already having heard that they wouldn't be pushed too far, came up with kind of a fig leaf there will be non-binding consultation with Palestinians before planning their communities. And we, of course, are still insisting that Palestinians be given real authority. And if the first principle, I think, of human rights is that we're all created in God's image and everything that flows from that, then a second principle is this idea that of empowerment, that our job is to try, that we have to help people have control as much as possible over their own lives. On principle, Rabbis for Human Rights is always working both on the human rights of Jewish Israelis and of non-Jews who are part of our society or under our control. So we have an education department, and we educate and we work with young Israelis about teaching about Judaism, human rights, and democracy. We work in gap programs between high school and the army. We work with university students, and we now even have a program of one of our publications, which is like a Talmudic-style commentary on Israel's Declaration of Independence, which is now going to be used by the Israeli army itself. We believe that economic justice is a human right. In this room, I don't think I have to explain that there is a great deal of poverty and despair among Palestinians. But you may not know that among Israelis, some 20% of the Israeli elderly are chronically hungry, choosing every day between medicine and food, including many Holocaust survivors. Some 25% of children and youth go to bed hungry at least one night a week. Somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of all Israelis live under the poverty line. And it's because we've been kind of we used to have one of the smallest gaps between rich and poor in the world. Today we vie with the United States for the largest, at least in the West. And we've been kind of on a lemmings march from a social welfare outlook to a neoliberal outlook in which the government feels it doesn't have responsibility for the poorest and weakest among us. When I go to the Knesset to talk about these issues, I often quote from the Talmud, from Sanhedrin. We're taught that there are 10 things which must exist in a community for a Talmud or a scholar to live there. And Maimonides, our great medieval scholar, expanded that to all Jews, one of them being a system for taking care of each other. One of our successes over the years is we defeated the so-called Israeli Wisconsin Plan. Have some of you heard of the Wisconsin Plan here in this country? A lovely idea. I want to get people off welfare and into the workforce. We can't argue with that. Except for it's born out of what we would call in Jewish terminology, the Lashon Hara. Thinking a priori poorly and negatively about people. And so the goal becomes not to fight unemployment, but to fight the unemployed, who are freeloaders and welfare queens driving Cadillacs and whatever else. And we fought this program by doing as we always do, whether we're helping Jews or Palestinians or whoever, with one foot in the grassroots and the other in the quarters of power. And so we set up a service center in Hadera, which is a mid-sized town in the middle of the country. And we helped family after family and took those stories in our hearts to the Knesset, to the press, until we got the program stopped. One of the amazing things that happened along the way was that we were coming up against a vote in subcommittee in the Knesset, and we thought we were goners because the for-profit corporations that were making a lot of money off this were pulling out all the stops to lobby. And I said, we had an empowerment group of women who were in the program, and I said, we have to bring them to come and lobby in the Knesset. And my staff said, nah, not a good idea. The Knesset can be a nasty place. Sometimes I think it's more dangerous to walk around in the Knesset than out in the middle of the occupied territories. And when I spoke to these women, I said, no one will think poorly of you if you think you're not ready for this. You're going to go into the Knesset where people have all these stereotypes about you. They think you're dirt. They don't want to give you the time of day. And somehow, you have to communicate the truth in your hearts to theirs. But maybe just as Mordechai says to Esther in the Bible, maybe just for this reason, you're here. And they did it. We won the vote. The most amazing thing was, the member of Knesset who most passionately argued against this program was Orly Levy. She's a member of what I would consider to be a racist party, Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party. And to argue against the program, she told word for word the personal story of an Israeli Arab woman from our empowerment group that she'd met just an hour before. Now, if anybody had said to me before this that somebody from a member of Knesset from Yisrael Beitenu with such empathy would tell the personal story of an Israeli Arab woman, I would have said, what have you been smoking? I want some too. I mean, it just can't happen, all right? It's just impossible. I learned two things that day. First of all, you never write anybody off, and you never discount the power of the truth in our hearts to speak to the hearts of others. We deal with the issue of African asylum seekers in Israel and with the issue of the Bedouin. Bedouin Israeli citizens, Israeli Arab citizens in the Negev. And thank God we stopped, or we froze, at least temporarily, a program that in 2013, if it had gone through, would have led to tens of so-called unrecognized villages being demolished, some 40,000 people being transferred from their homes into townships that have been created for them, and then losing most of the remaining lands. What is an unrecognized village? Is they don't exist, they're not on the map. Even if they existed before the state of Israel, for example, one of them, when they went to court because a road was going to go straight through their village, the government response was, what village? There's no village there. They don't exist. We're far from out of the woods because the government now, even in the coalition agreements for the new government, is to move forward with this again. And now I'm going to tell you why it's not going to pass. Because we, the Jewish people, are better than that. I couldn't do what I do if I didn't have deep faith in the basic decency and goodness of my fellow Israelis. And we did an opinion poll. Some 90% of Israeli Jews subscribe to the statement, the Bedouin are taking over the Negev. So we said, let's unpack that. What do you mean by that? So some 70% thought that the Bedouin want to take over 25% more or more than the Negev. The median was 43.9%. So for a cold-blooded matzo ball, if all the outstanding Bedouin land claims would be to be recognized and honored, what percentage of the Negev are we talking about? 5.4%. Okay? And your average Israeli Jew said, well, I'm not sure that we believe you because that's what we heard in the media. But if that's true, that sounds fair. We can support that. Have we, sadly, in our short history, been all too often oppressors or destroyers or transferers? Yes. Is it who we are in our Jewish soul? No, it isn't. And what that study shows is that when we peel away a lot of the disinformation, then something else comes through. And that's one of the things that allows me to keep doing what I do. People ask me all the time how you can do it. Because I don't feel like our job is to be rubbing the nose of the naughty puppy in the mess they've made. But it's rather to hold up a mirror and to say to our fellow Israelis, we know that you are good and decent people. We know that you want to be doing the right thing. But sometimes you have to look in the mirror and see what's really happening. Our word for prayer in the Jewish tradition is litpalel. It's a reflexive verb, meaning to judge oneself. We who are created in God's image and must be as godlike as humanly possible. We need to look at that mirror that we call God and see how we're measuring up. And it drives me crazy, yes, when you hear almost every single Israeli will repeat the idea we have the most moral army in the world. I don't think we have the most immoral army by any means. You know, are many places on this planet, and I never forget the fact that there are many places on this planet that if I were to do a speaking tour like this, I wouldn't be allowed home. If I were allowed home, my life would be in danger. I thank God every day that I live in a place, in a country which allows me to do what I do. And even when it means being a gadfly or fighting the injustice I see in my own country. But what was I about to say? I was talking about the army. But even when they say that, even though I unfortunately can't agree that that's the case, it's because that's what they aspire to. So that's what we aspire to as a people. And for me, not that it is a simple thing to try to break people's bubbles and say, well, reality isn't quite the way you've constructed for yourselves. Nevertheless, it seems to me to be an easier task than if I were dealing with an intransigently incorrigible people that were just inherently always bent on doing the wrong thing. When I moved back across the Green Line into the occupied territories, the other major issue that we work on, besides the home demolitions, is our olive tree campaign. And here again, the good news is that in 2001, 2002, when we were literally acting as human shields so that Palestinians could try to safely get to their olive groves, and facing sometimes violent settlers. Not all settlers are violent, but some of them certainly are, and I've seen plenty of them firsthand. And we were being beaten, shot at, attacked, cursed, you name it. And the Israeli security forces were either not showing up or coming late or standing by. As a result of our being in the olive groves day after day after day, and then going to Israel's high court, again, using Israel's democracy, we won in 2006 a victory, as a result of which today, Palestinian farmers are getting to lands by a court mandate that they couldn't get to for 2, 10, 15 years, because by court order, the army must make sure that Palestinians get to every single olive tree and protect them. And if you come and volunteer, as people often do with us in the olive harvest, which is in October, you won't be putting yourself in the same kind of danger you would have been a couple of years ago, because it is the army that has the pleasure, dubious pleasure, of dealing with some of these settlers. And you'll see that it's really happening. Not perfect by any means, but it's really happening. And we have a legal team that has returned thousands of dunams to Palestinian owners after they've been taken over. It's not simple. Right now, and it's a perfect example of why we have to return Palestinian planning authority to Palestinian hands. The village of Susia right now, in the South Hebron Hills. A village in 1986, they were expelled from their village because an ancient synagogue had been found in the village and it was now being made into an archaeological site. They had to go to their agricultural lands where they couldn't get permits because of the zoning and building discrimination that I've spoken about. When they were expelled in 2001, the High Court sent them back, but after the army had destroyed the caves they were living in, and they couldn't rebuild the caves, they couldn't build homes. So what we call in Yiddish, nishta here, nishta here, neither here nor there. And right now there's an all-out effort by the settlers to demolish the village entirely and take over their lands. But our legal team is fighting that. But sometimes I meet soldiers, and they're angry, and they're resentful. Why is my commander said my job today is to protect Palestinians? Now who knows who among them has lost a loved one or an army buddy in a terror attack and say, I have to go protect their human rights? That's an emotionally impossible thing to ask of anybody. You can think of the parallels from the Palestinian side. But that's what you have to do. We have a midrash. It's a form of ancient rabbinic commentary on the Bible. Some of you may recall the story of Hagar and Ishmael being banished into the desert. They're dying of thirst. And according to the biblical narrative, God prepares a well and saves them. But according to the midrash, written by the rabbis almost 2,000 years ago, before God prepares that well, the angels come to God and say, what are you doing? Don't you know all the sorrows, all the trouble that the Jewish people are going to suffer from the children of Ishmael throughout history? Let them die, just like it right here. And God, according to this midrash written by the rabbis 2,000 years ago, said no. God knows that Abraham loves both of his sons. God knows that no future is inevitable. And God says, Basher Husham. Right now in front of me is an innocent child. And we too, who are created in God's image, and therefore must be as godlike as humanly possible, we too must distinguish between the terrorists coming to murder my children, and I have had bombs go off not far from my home, and that family that somebody wants to put a roof over their heads or harvest their olives. And finally, it all comes down to hope. Because since the 2000s, since the Second Intifada, we Jews and Palestinians have been in one collective depression, living without hope. Poll after poll shows a sane majority of both Israelis and Palestinians who want a compromise negotiated agreement, but even a larger percentage on both sides that says we want peace, but they don't. For all the ways you can talk about symmetry between Israelis and Palestinians, because we Israelis have so much more political, economic, and military power. We are incredibly symmetrical in two ways. First of all, we say we want peace, but they don't. And secondly, we say, I'm the victim. Speak to any Israeli or Palestinian and say you're a victimizer, and they will be furious, outraged. How dare you say that I am a victimizer? I'm the victim. You know, there was a late 19th, early 20th century Rabbi Tamarat, and he wrote in his commentary that the reason why the children of Israel had to stay in their homes when the angel of death passed over Egypt is because even when your cause is just, violence corrupts, and the difference between being a victim and a victimizer can be less than a hairbreadth. And sometimes you can be both at the same time. But when you don't think that there's anybody to reciprocate, why take a rest for peace? I don't know how many times when I've gone to rebuild a demolished home and Palestinian parents have insisted that their children come out and meet with us. And like deja vu, the same conversation. My 10-year-old son has just seen his home demolished. He's just seen his parents humiliated. What do we say to our 10-year-old child when he says, I want to grow up and be a terrorist? We want our son to know that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes, that there are Israelis who come to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild our homes. Why is it that we correctly get upset when we hear about terrible propaganda being taught in Palestinian schools about Israelis? It's because we know that even if we sign the perfect peace treaty tomorrow, if we continue to teach hate about each other, that treaty can't last. And most people in Israel, on the right as well as the left, understand there is no military solution. And that means we're either going to live together or we're going to die together. And those of us who are sane would much rather live together. So when our survival is predicated on breaking down these stereotypes, then who is really doing more for Israel's long-term security interests? The people that demolish homes and steal olives and uproot trees and steal land, or those of us who rebuild the homes and replant the trees and pick the olives and return the land to its owners? Yes, I think what we're doing is a just and right and Jewish thing to do. But to be totally honest, it's a self-interested thing to do. It's the best thing I can do to protect my children. And the real Zionism today, and I am a Zionist, is to work for an Israel which is not only politically, is not only military strong, but is morally strong, and living up to our highest Jewish values. And only I, as an Israeli, particularly a religious Israeli, because the deepest held stereotypes that Palestinians have about Israelis is about religious Israelis. We're all violent, fanatic settlers. Only I can empower the Palestinian peacemaker to be heard on his or her street. When the person on the Palestinian street says, make peace with them? Impossible. And Palestinians have to empower me. We're in it together. We're in it together. April 15th, 2004, tax day in America. I'm in the village of Bidu, one of 8 villages that went to the Israeli High Court against the route of the separation barrier. They won. Although when they sent the army back to the drawing board, although when the army came back to the drawing board, I don't think the court sufficiently stuck to its own principles. But on this day, I get a phone call to come quickly to another neighborhood because a 13-year-old boy has been caught by the border police. He's being beaten. I and two other Israelis make our way to where this is happening. The border police start shooting tear gas at us. The other two go back. I'm the only one stupid enough to keep on going forward. When I get there, the commander beckons me forward, grabs me by the throat, starts shaking me violently, headbutts me, starts screaming, "You're arrested, you're arrested." I didn't know why I was arrested. I certainly knew I was arrested at that point. I see this young boy strapped to the windshield of a Jeep, shivering in fear, unsuccessfully trying to hold back the tears. Another man sent by the worried parents has been handcuffed in front of a second Jeep. Same was done with me and a third person. The Palestinian youth who decided not to throw stones at their own started throwing stones, hitting the Jeeps that were forced to be in front of, and for the next couple hours were used as human shields. And I conclude with this story for two reasons. First of all, because Israel has such great freedom of the press, this was caught on film. It appeared around the world. It was in this country in Newsweek. And I was inundated by the press afterwards. And we're not shy about working with the press. But at a certain point, I said to one of these reporters, "You're obsessing on this." Some of them. It's not like it only could have happened in Israel. 2 weeks later, the first revelations about the American army in Abu Ghraib came out. And we know, of course, unfortunately, that wherever people put on uniform, all too often they think it gives them the permission to violate the very laws they're supposed to be upholding. Many of you may be familiar with the Stanford University Perpendicular prison experiments back in the 1970s. You take a group of students, make half of them arbitrarily guards, half of them inmates, and they had to stop it after a day because the people that had been fellow students the day before were now so sadistic. So as somebody who spends just about every waking hour fighting Israeli injustice, I am opposed to double standards. I'm opposed to somehow judging Israel more harshly or coddling Israel, but that Israel should be treated like anybody else. I'm opposed to double standards. But the other reason I tell this story is because who knows what psychological scars that young boy will have for the rest of his life. I know he's waking up for at least a month with nightmares. To this day, he's not all well. Who knows what he's thinking about all Israelis? Maybe all Jews. But when he gave an affidavit to our fellow human rights organization, B'Tselem, after describing all the horrific things that happened to him, he concluded by saying that a tall Jewish man in a kippah came to my rescue, told me not to be afraid. The work that we do has its dangers. I've been on many occasions beaten up by Israeli security forces, attacked by settlers, and it's kind of equal opportunity out there. I've had my car stoned by Palestinians. And it's not fun. It's not fun as an Israeli, as a rabbi, as a Jew, as a Zionist, to deal every day with the deepest, darkest corners of the country that I love, whether it be how we're treating our fellow Israelis in Hadera, or how we're treating Palestinians, or African asylum seekers, or anybody else. But I'll do it again and again with a young boy who says that a tall Jewish man in a kippah came to my rescue, told me not to be afraid. Because if there's going to be any hope for any of his children or mine, for any of us, that's the only way. That's the only way. And yes, there are days when I get up and I say, couldn't a nice Jewish boy do something better than stand in front of bulldozers? And what's the point of it all? And sometimes I feel like I'm the man who knows too much. I'd be a happier person if I hadn't experienced personally so many things I have experienced about the country that I so deeply and dearly love. The people that I love. But I don't think this is unique to Israel. I dare say that everybody in this room has or will have at least one, if not many times, experience in your life where people that you love very much are doing something you can't believe that they're doing. It's not just Israel. And then the question is, what do you do? You can stick your head in the sand and say it's not happening. I don't want to know about it. You go to the opposite extreme. Terrible, racist, apartheid state, it ain't me, babe. But it is me, babe. It's my army. It's my people. It's our Torah. And so there's a third route. And that's the route that we choose to take. And that's taking the pain that we're feeling. Pain that we're feeling, the things that we do not want to believe could possibly be happening in the country that we love, and letting that pain push us forward to do what we call tikkun olam, what some in the Christian community call co-creationism, to be God's partners in creating a world a little bit closer to the one that God dreams and envisions up for us, a little bit closer to the one that we dreamed and envisioned for ourselves when we Israelis wrote our Declaration of Independence. That's what we try to do in Rabbis for Human Rights.
Can you talk about your position? You've already told me in other conversations that Rabbis for Human Rights doesn't take a position on this, but could you talk about BDS and particularly, I think that there are gradations. There's the, we will boycott settlement stuff, we will boycott anything from Israel, we don't want any academic exchanges, we don't want whatever. Can you talk about
so
that?
straight to the nitty-gritty. Okay.
Yes.
Now the temperature will rise a little bit in the room. Okay. So I think people know that this is an extremely, extremely volatile issue. I think both, certainly in the Jewish community and in many of the church communities that have been taking this up and others. And yes, we as Rabbis of Human Rights do not have a position, this is my personal opinion. I don't buy settlement products. And I could, in certain circumstances, support, I don't go for cultural or academic boycotts. I could support a specific targeted boycott of the corporation building settlements or whatever. However, I started my kind of political education in many ways in the anti-apartheid movement as a university student, trying to get our university to divest. And of course, the divestiture movement helped end apartheid.
Yeah.
I remember myself demonstrating against the war and for sanctions in Iraq. We got both. I think most of us would acknowledge today that maybe the war was worse than the sanctions, but the sanctions only caused suffering for average Iraqis. They certainly didn't do anything to change the regime. And so we can't assume that sanctions will have the same impact in every case. So beyond the fact that I think that a total boycott of Israel is really collective punishment against my friends, most people would say that the reason why divestiture worked in South Africa is because it was psychological more than financial. South Africans so much wanted to be a part of the community of nations. People say that what was most devastating for them was the sports boycott. Israel's very different. We assume that the world hates us. We assume that the world's against us. We assume that the world's anti-Semitic. We look at the fact that the world didn't lift a finger to stop it, the Holocaust. We look at the fact that the UN Human Rights Commission spends more time on Israel than any other issue. Although, as I said, there are certainly many worse human rights violators out there in the world. And that's, of course, by no means to justify any of our human rights violations. And this is all picked up by our own demagogues. So that, yes, the BDS movement is very wide. There are people who are anti-Israel, period, under any border, in any borders, in any circumstances. And there are those who are anti-occupation. And there are those who think that we Israelis, or maybe Israelis and Palestinians, are so dysfunctional that no change will come from within, and those who would argue that as important as international pressure is, that there has to be a change also of hearts and minds of Israelis. So if you are anti-occupation, but not anti-Israel, and you want Israelis to understand that, and you think that Israeli opinion counts for something, then the only way I can imagine to have some sliver of a possibility of getting our fellow Israelis to understand that is if money that is pulled out of a corporation building settlements or whatever is reinvested in something positive in Israel. I think, and by the way, of course, in the Presbyterian resolution from a year ago, there was a clause like that. I don't know to what degree it's being implemented, but I think that reinvestment, also in something positive in Israel, is the way to explain to Israelis, perhaps, it won't be easy, that the goal is, it's not to be anti-Israel, but to be anti-occupation. Yes?
Thank you, Rabbi, for your witness. And my question is, how can there possibly be an inclusive, multi-faith democracy that's also a single religious state, i.e. a Jewish state?
Okay. So the whole issue of what does it mean to be a Jewish state? Our first prime minister, in a speech he gave, and maybe he would talk about the fact that we have to be totally equal to every citizen, Jewish or non-Jewish. And he asked the question, so what does it mean to be a Jewish state? And he says that we'll have a Jewish majority based on the fact that we will always encourage the ingathering of the exiles from around the world. There is a flaw with that, insofar as one of the challenges to our democracy is that ultimately Israelis believe that anything that the majority decides is therefore democratic. And of course, in sophisticated democracy, there's also what the majority cannot do, such as to trample the rights of minorities. I would say, basically, that as long that I would be happy to live in a world without nation states. No more United States, Mexico, or Canada. No more Sweden, Norway, or Denmark. No borders in the Middle East. But as long as we're living in a world of nation states, we Jews have the same right, not more right, but the same right to national self-determination as anybody else. And therefore, like so many countries around the world, it is therefore appropriate that there be a state that has a Jewish majority with full rights, which we don't have right now, but find me a democracy where there isn't. We're some of the same things that many democracies struggle with. And of course, there's no democracy in the occupied territories. But within Israel proper, as long as we're living in a world organized according to nation states, we have the same rights. And I would hope that just as I and many of us support the full rights of Palestinians, that those who are supporting Palestinians will also understand that just as my Zionism says, anything I ask for myself, I have to be prepared to give to others, including Palestinians. I think that goes two ways. In other words, anything that Palestinians ask for themselves, they have to be prepared to give me as well. Okay. Yes?
Following up on that, what would it look like if there were peace? There is no viable Palestinian state at this point, and yet if it became one state, it's not going to be a Jewish majority.
So that's a very good point. And an American Jewish intellectual who just died this past year, unfortunately, Leonard Fine, one of the founding editors of a Jewish magazine called Moment Magazine, wrote back in the 1970s, we Jews can talk about our legitimate rights until we're blue in the face, and so can Palestinians. The problem is that sometimes those clash, and that's why we talk about compromise. Even in the Talmud, and the rabbis were so fixed on creating a legal system, they also talk about the importance of compromise sometimes. And even I, as a human rights activist, have to say that, because For example, if I believe that the right of return for Palestinians is a legitimate right, and I believe that national self-determination for the Jewish people is a right, and those are equal rights, and full exercising of Palestinian right of return leaves no room for any Jewish self-determination, and full Jewish self-determination on the entire biblical land of Israel leaves no room for Palestinian right of return or Palestinian self-determination. There will have to be some kind of compromise. We as an organization have no position in where borders should be, or a 1 or a 2 or a 10-state solution. For me, it's an issue of process, my personal opinion, that Israelis and Palestinians have to negotiate and come to an agreement without coercion, because you can be sitting around a table with plenty of coercion going on underneath the table. And we talk about a just and viable peace, because sometimes leaders sign a piece of paper just to say they signed a piece of paper, but they can't deliver. Neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians delivered on what they promised in the Oslo Accords. And that's why we have to have a peace that ensures that everybody is getting what they need. And another thing is, although I very much believe in a negotiated agreement, negotiation cannot be an excuse for dragging things out ad infinitum. In a rare moment of honesty for a politician, even maybe more than when Netanyahu just said there'll never be a Palestinian state under my watch, during the Madrid process, Yitzhak Shamir, our prime minister at the time, he lost an election in the middle of the process, and he said, too bad, my plan was to keep on talking and talking and talking while populating the West Bank until everyone would wake up one day and realize that there was nothing left to talk about. So that again, the insistence on negotiation cannot be an excuse for letting things drag out forever.
But I would like to know, if you could write the final peace agreement, what would it look like?
I couldn't care less. I will accept anything that Israelis and Palestinians come up with together, our leadership together. And I'm prepared to live in a 2-state solution, I'm prepared to live in a 1-state solution, I'm prepared for all kinds of things. I really think it's more about process. I think we make a mistake when we insist on one, this is the right solution and this is the wrong solution. I really think it's about process. Yes?
I want to get back to the comparison of the U.S. democracy and Israeli democracy.
Someone up here said, well, saying that we're more democratic than the United States isn't saying much, but okay. But
Well, I want to hopefully raise one point where it is. When you were on trial, you were convicted.
yes.
Did you appeal directly in order to seek an order from the High Court to stop demolishing Palestinian homes? Or was that an original proceeding before the High Court in Begat?
That's an original proceeding. In other words, my trial is entirely separate. It was when I was in trial that we started realizing that we had to do something else if we were ever going to stop this, what I would call Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. But and we started working on it. Normally, unlike the American Supreme Court, usually you can go to the Israeli Supreme Court and get there within a couple of weeks. But for all kinds of reasons, it took us 10 years. Among other reasons, by the way, that in the last couple of years, the prosecutor, the Attorney General's office that was going to have to defend the state, they knew we were right, and they wanted more time to try to convince the army that we were right. They didn't succeed, unfortunately, but that was also one of the reasons, for example, for some of the delays. That is a kind of an independent procedure, and now we're waiting to see what the results will be.
And did the Palestinians have the right to bring those actions?
Yes. So in fact, we have a Palestinian village and several NGOs, including Palestinian NGOs, that are co-appellants with us. That is maybe the strength and one of the strengths and weaknesses of Israeli democracy. The fact that Palestinians can come to the highest court in the land for justice, and sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't. I can give you a long string of successes and a long string of places where I don't think the decision of our high court was in line with international law or many other things. It's also our weakness, because Palestinians have to come to our court for justice. There is no Palestinian court that they can go to in these issues. They have to come to our court. So it really is kind of the strengths and the weaknesses all in one of our democracy, I think. Yes?
Thank you so much for your work and for visiting and being here with us. I'm curious of your opinion of the recent elections and also the coalition formation,
Sure.
which from what we hear here, it looks very anti-peace.
Right. This is a very most right-wing coalition we've ever had. The ray of hope is that one of our successes, even, is in the last few years, we've succeeded in making internal economic justice issues for Israelis. We put them high on the agenda. They were talked about a lot in these elections. Our new finance minister is Moshe Kachman, the Kulanu party. There's no daylight between him and the Likud on Palestinian issues. But he, as a former Likud minister, he left the Likud in great anger because he didn't feel that the Likud was attending to issues of social economic justice for Israelis. He doesn't trust Netanyahu for a second. And he has positioned himself and his party to move forward issues of public housing and other things that we're very concerned about. He also, to my pleasant surprise, another one of our great concerns is that the current coalition is licking its chops, waiting to undermine what we do have in terms of Israeli democracy in many ways. Okay? On their gun sights is our judiciary, which is today our last best hope, and they want to undermine its independence. Kachlan has said that in negotiations he insisted on veto power to prevent, even though we have our new Justice Minister, Ayelet Shaked, who is declared that's one of her goals, and her party's goals, is to change the way our judiciary works and everything, so that they want our judiciary to look like the electorate. And again, what we read, particularly in Israel, but in any place, is a judiciary which is independent and isn't just a carbon copy of the Knesset or of the electorate, for precisely the reason that a democracy has to have a balance between respecting the will of the majority without creating a tyranny of the majority. And I hope that he will stick to his word. Another very dangerous piece of legislation that we were expecting, but we may have some relief from an unexpected quarter, was the so-called nationality law. In other words, if we've already talked about some of the problematics of what it means to be a Jewish state, can you really be a Jewish and democratic state? And many would say you cannot. But a law, we have something in Israel called basic law. In lieu of a constitution, we have things that are called basic laws that require an extraordinary majority to change. And one of the important things that does give us some leverage on human rights issues is Chok Kavod Adam V'Chiruto, the law of the dignity of humanity and dignity for freedom of humanity. And that is a law that got through the Knesset. It can't be changed very easily, and it does ensconce in law certain human rights principles. And these people say, well, if we're going to be a Jewish and democratic state, that's a democratic. We need the Jewish part. We need a law. It doesn't talk just about being a Jewish state, but a state belonging to the Jews. And ensconcing in law Jewish privilege. And that is a very dangerous thing, of course. And who may be scuttling it for us is, of all people, believe it, it's the ultra-Orthodox parties. Because the ultra-Orthodox parties say you can't really be a Jewish state if it's not run according to Jewish law. And until the Messiah comes, for us, of course, the Messiah hasn't come yet. And therefore, they vetoed that in the coalition negotiations. Another piece of law that no one's fighting, and could be very bad for us, for example, is the desire to create legislation attacking the funding of organizations like ours, for example, and these kinds of things. And we're expecting that we're going to have to fight that. So there was a message of concern in the vote in the last elections about economic justice for Israelis, particularly Israeli Jews. But unfortunately, the message coming from the elections regarding non-Jews, be they Palestinians or Israeli Palestinians or Israeli citizens or African asylum seekers, was something between disinterest and hostility. And so, yes, we are expecting an onslaught and a very difficult time in anything to do with the human rights of non-Jews. And as far as I'm concerned, when Netanyahu said there will never be a Palestinian state on my watch, he was just saying, being honest about what basically most of us knew in any case. So, so we don't really see a lot of options. Although, and I'm not one of these who says let it get as bad as it can. So I'm not kind of that kind of a Marxist or whatever. And I'm very aware that that means a lot of suffering for a lot of people. However, it may be that there is a kind of a dialectic here, and the things that Netanyahu said in order when he thought he might lose the elections may be his own undoing, and that in fact that in the international community and even in a lot of the mainstream Jewish community, these were bombshells, and his comments about warning against Arabs flocking to the polls and these kinds of things, and we do know that the reaction to those things, the elections and to the Gaza war, and everything may cause a kind of dialectic which actually may lead to Netanyahu's undoing and this kind of thing. Yes?
I'm curious about your thoughts for the future.
Yes.
When do you think there will be a level playing field? When will that happen?
I wish I knew. As I said earlier, that is a basic principle of human rights, that you have to have empowerment and a level playing field. I don't know if we've ever achieved that anywhere in the world. Certainly not in Israel or Israel-Palestine. I can tell you that, again, that's part of the goal of this one case that we've instituted to try to return planning and zoning authorities for Palestinian communities to Palestinian hands. That's certainly something we believe in. When it will happen, I don't know. This isn't exactly an answer, but what I will say is I think our greatest challenge is what I call spiritual myopia. All right? I'll give you an example. I wrote during the Gaza war this summer, When Justice Blinds. And part of our challenge this summer was that we were all right. And so what would the United States do if one rocket was shot at it, let alone thousands? And because we were absolutely right, we had the absolute right, and any country in the world would defend itself, that the fact that we were the justice of our cause blinded us to the fact that there were human beings on the other side of that border. And the fact is, I often do a little exercise with Israelis. Every single Israeli can quote from the Talmud where we're taught, if someone's coming to kill you, you get up earlier and you kill them first. We are not a pacifist religion. We do have a right and responsibility to defend ourselves. But then I ask people how the Talmud continues. And then I get blank stares. So we're taught about the rodef. Somebody is chasing after somebody else to murder them. You must murder the potential murderer, kill the potential murderer to prevent him from killing somebody else. But we're taught if you could have stopped that person in any other way, you could have shouted. If you could have shot him in the foot, you could have started a peace process. And you kill that person, even though you were trying to do the right thing, you were trying to save a human being. You yourself become guilty of murder. And then the standards get even higher, maybe higher than most human beings could ever aspire to. Although once we call this, in our own tradition of the Israeli army, purity of arms. We're taught about the man who comes to Rabbah, One of the same Talmudic rabbis that a couple pages earlier said if someone's coming to kill you, you get earlier and kill them first. But now the question is, the strong man in my village is going to come kill me if I don't go kill this innocent third person. What should I do? Rabbah would have had no problem had the question been, can I defend myself against the person coming to kill me? But regarding the innocent person, he says, let yourself be killed rather than kill. Who is to say that your blood is redder than his? Okay? So even when we have a just cause, there have to be limits. And we asked another question. We have another saying in Hebrew, the wise person never gets into the situations the clever person knows how to get out of. Once we were being shot at, and the question was, how many people do we harm on the other side to protect ourselves? That's already a lose-lose situation. Could we have done anything never to get to that lose-lose situation? In June, not only did we not lift the blockade of Gaza, we harshened it. Up till then, we're not even talking about imports where you can say is it dual use or whatever. We're talking about exports, and where we had been forbidding exports to West Bank or to Israel, but out in the rest of the world, and we stopped that. If we hadn't done that, would it have changed things? I don't know, but I'm certainly asking those questions. All right. But the justice of our cause blinded us to all of that. And on the Gazan side, the absolute justice of resisting after years, almost 50 years of occupation and blockade now, blinded them to the humanity of the Israelis on the other side of the border, Sderot and other places. There was no sane center. One day I was on national television, and the supposedly neutral interviewer steps out of her role to say, "You are shooting our soldiers in the back." Simply for raising the fact that what I just said, that although we have a right to defend ourselves, there are limits, and maybe we have to ask him how we could have avoided getting into that situation to begin with. And then a few days later, I'm in a 3-day, day and night, all day marathon email session with people who could not bring themselves to say there was anything wrong with firing rockets at Israelis or building tunnels to murder Israelis. And it was just a totally depressing feeling that there is no sane center. And although I'm kind of gone a bit far afield from your question, my point is that as long as we have this spiritual myopia, where the justice of our cause blinds us to the image of God to people on the other side, there will be no level playing field, and there will be no, ultimately, I don't think we're really going to get to where we need to be. Okay, I'll see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, yes.
This is rather a nitpicky thing, but you were indicating that you all have good freedom of press in Israel. Yet, when about 3 months ago, had a group with J Street and some of the other organizations of that sort here, a gal who just come back from Israel said that no one over there had been aware that, for example, that the children playing on the beach in Gaza, soccer, had been shelled by the Israeli planes at the very beginning of this last war.
That's absolutely not true. I have to say, it came out the day it happened. We all knew it.
Okay.
All right? There is sometimes self-censorship. There are things that happen that we never see, not because there's censorship, but, and I'll give you an example. In the first Gaza war, everybody around the world saw in real time that we were using white phosphorus.
Yeah.
And that was never shown on Israeli, not because it was being censored, just because it's kind of self-censorship. And of course, anybody, again, you can surf the net. You can see what was on CNN or BBC or whatever else. Many people choose not to do. And so when the world accused us of using white phosphorus, it was obviously one more anti-Israel, anti-Semitic attack. A year later, the army admitted that they used white phosphorus. but by then it was too late. So it's not perfect, but that thing that you brought up, and in general, there is extreme freedom of the press and some very good and courageous Israeli reporters that get most of that stuff out. Yes. Okay. It's going
I
around.
don't know if that was 2 or 3.
Okay. I think, since you already asked a question, let's make 2 over here and then we'll go around.
So I just thought it's interesting in that light, in terms of how many different Israels there are and how many different parties there are. That I remember reading the Jerusalem Post's analysis of the election right after the election happened, and it said, Herzog elected president of Tel Aviv, so and so elected president. It was like each area elected somebody else. But one of the most interesting things, and especially because the Shaliach, the agent for the Jewish National Fund, here in this last 2 years, her family came from one of those settlements. So not settlements. I mean, they were just towns, okay, because they're not in any occupied territory along the border that was getting shelled. In that, basically they had 5 seconds to get from the bus into the thing, and sometimes it actually hit the bus.
Right.
It turned out that one of the things that was so surprising was that those towns along the edge, the ones that were being targeted so strongly, actually voted for Labor in the election. In other words, they voted for these. They didn't vote for Likud. They voted for Labor, even though they were the ones who were getting shelled by it.
Some of them,
those ironies are so
some of them because
weird.
they didn't think the government was using enough force, and some of them because they've come to realize that force isn't going to solve their issues, and that there's got to be another way of doing it.
You've talked about your organization and B'Tselem and having lawyers in Israel and other resources to try to further the issues and the causes that you so eloquently talk about. Are you aware of similar groups in the occupied territories? I mean, I know the whole political thing is very different, but are there groups of imams or Christian leaders who do what you and other rabbis are doing?
There is no imams for human rights, but there are many both religious and secular Palestinian leaders who get it and understand Israeli human rights as well as Palestinian human rights. There are some Palestinian human rights activists who are in a lot more danger than I am because they criticize the Palestinian Authority. We actually, I should have mentioned, we now have a new department, what was formerly an independent organization, the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel, which is now a Department of Rabbis and Human Rights, and we work a lot with Muslim and Christian religious leaders in a lot of different ways. I'll tell you about one of my heroes. It was a guy named Abu Gabia. He spent 13 years in Israeli security prisons. He would say of himself, I was part of the armed resistance, but because he didn't have blood on his hands, he was released under the Oslo Accords. 13 years had given him a lot of time to think. He came out totally committed to nonviolence. I literally have seen him stop stone throwers' hands in midair. And we would have late night conversations about what he was doing to keep his children from making some of the same mistakes that he had made. And he would often say to me, it is so important that my people see us working together nonviolently and succeeding to show that there is another way. And particularly because he'd been a former prisoner, he also had some standing in his own society. And another person we worked with, an imam who had been Hamas, left Hamas. I had learned to read Hebrew in jail, wanted us to give him a copy. He'd already studied the Jewish Bible very intensively, wanted a Hebrew copy now, this kind of stuff. And so there are people out there. And as I said earlier, the question is how do we empower them? How do we empower them to listen to their fellow Palestinians? Yes.
Yeah. I read somewhere in the stuff I get on the computer that on several occasions Hamas has declared a truce So no rocket fire into Israel, and sometimes there are other little groups that are doing the rocket that Hamas actually tries to stop, but then I think they're trying to get some kind of reciprocation from Israel to, do something, so I don't know if does that actually happen in what?
There have been decisions over the years by Hamas sometimes not to do attacks or not to do attacks inside Israel.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that's alleged about the first Gaza war again is that in fact, there had been an agreement in June before the war broke up in November, in which Hamas had agreed to stop the firing rockets at Israel. They didn't fully do that, and again, one rocket is too many, but they largely did that. And when it was time to come to renew, he said, but Israel had also agreed to something. They were supposed to ease up on the blockade. They never did that. And will they do it now? And Israel allegedly said no. I wasn't in on these negotiations, but that's one of the things I would love to see investigated. And maybe there was reasons why they said no, but I certainly asked the question, might we have avoided that war if we had said yes? It's a very good question. There was a question over here, somebody asked.
Yeah.
And I know people are about ready to leave, and we'll try to wrap up pretty soon. Yes.
A couple of things come to mind. I think it was Jesse Helms who called Israel America's aircraft carrier in the Middle East, kind of used by the U.S. empire to project power in the region and to fight back Arab nationalism. And I was wondering to what extent, I was also reading Paul Cavell's book, Living in the Shadow of the Cross, which is about the history of, say, Christian Zionism, which oftentimes is very anti-Semitic. They don't want Jews in the U.S. And there's the whole narrative of people like Pastor Hagee, Citizens United for Israel, which is, again, not good for Jews or Arabs or anybody in the region. As a citizen of the United States, I was wondering if you could suggest to us things we can do here in the empire to counter the battles. We're good at getting tribes to fight each other, so how can we pull back?
I'm going to take what you said one step further because, and I'll hook into something people said before we started, and I've heard in other places, where people, particularly in the Christian community, say, if we say a little bit about what we feel in our hearts, we're going to be labeled anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, with this, what can we do? And I would make 3 suggestions. The first is we all have to check ourselves. And whether, in spite of our best intentions, we are harboring some biases and double standards. And we're human, we all do that. Okay, that's the first question. That's the first thing. The second thing, and I am so happy that there are, and I should say, I know that there, I don't think I'm saying anything that people don't know, that there's been a bit of tension between the Jewish community and some of the sponsoring organizations here in recent years. And I'm so happy that there are members also of the Jewish community and these different organizations here today. I hope maybe that will be the beginning of some sort of dialogue. But my second thing is you have to reach out to the Jewish community. And not just the most radical Jewish community, but the mainstream of the Jewish community. Doesn't mean that you're going to agree on everything. But the dynamic becomes a bit different when you're talking about people, not a faceless thing. And my third suggestion is to go to Israel together, Israel-Palestine. Because one of the things that happens is certain groups, you come and you get the Israeli government tour of you meet with government officials, you get the army tour of the separation barrier, you meet with Israeli families that have lost loved ones to terror, and other groups come and you meet the Palestinian families of the Shahidim, you see the demolished homes, you see the barrier from the Palestinian side, and sometimes never the twain shall meet. And because you've all come and you've seen truth, you know what the truth is. Anyone who is representing something so totally different has got to be lying, has got to be being duplicitous, some kind of nefarious motives. And what I've suggested to many groups, and some have done it, is to come together, everybody having a hand in setting the itinerary. And it doesn't mean that, again, that you're all going to come back and agree on everything. But at least you can have some kind of common set of experiences to argue about, which is totally missing, because today people are all too often in such different worlds. And I have to say something else. And I've had the honor of being hosted by the Jewish community now for the last couple of days. This is an extremely liberal Jewish community that you have here in Boulder, okay? I mean, I said Rabbi Firestone has been out with me rebuilding Palestinian homes. Rabbi Shapiro is very connected to some of the groups in Israel where there are actually Palestinians and settlers talking to each other, and so on. Sorry?
Rabbi Soloway.
And Rabbi Soloway has been very involved, and Rabbi Glickman, and so many of the rabbis in the community. And so I actually think that you actually have what to work with here of trying to start some dialogue. I will also say what, in my opinion, is the, not Rabbi Shapiro, Rabbi Silver, excuse me. And Rabbi Soloway has been doing outreach to, and some of the other rabbis, to the Muslim community here. There are a lot of, it's an extremely, the line for, I think, people in the Jewish community is the difference between criticism of Israel and delegitimization of Israel. And I know that sometimes people may think that they are criticizing Israel, and somebody else is hearing delegitimization when that was not the intent. And that's one more reason why you need to be talking. But I think that really is the dividing line, and that I think that there are many people in the Jewish community, and some of the people here maybe speak for themselves instead of me speaking for them. But I think that yes, there are people that it's Israel right or wrong, and yes, there are people Palestine right or wrong. But I think that there are, as I said, a lot of people in this community who can share a commitment to working for change, as long as it isn't seen as denying Israel's very right to exist in any borders.
Amen.
So I know we're kind of running over, and you've all taken a lot of time on a Memorial Day weekend. And I just want to conclude by saying that it is not easy to be an activist here or there, okay? And I really have such great admiration to all the people here. Thank you to everybody that have organized this today. Thank you to First Methodist for opening up your doors, even though it took us a little while to get them open. We got here, all right? You know, and yes, to be an activist, and I'm sure many of you can identify with this, you have to have a certain predilection for beating your head against the wall. But sometimes the wall breaks, all right? It would be hard for me to continue to do what I do if I couldn't point to very real circumstances where there are Palestinian farmers on lands that they hadn't been for 14 years, and if there weren't Israelis with a better center of health care or an improvement in the issue of public housing and whatever else. And we have, you know, once I was out harvesting olives, and I'm a little bit surprised when I find out that the young man picking olives next with me, helping his family as people leave their jobs to help participate in olive harvest, that his normal day job at the time, he was part of Yasser Arafat's presidential guard. Now, I was a little bit blown away to be working for someone from the presidential guard. This guy was 10 times more blown away to be working with an Israeli rabbi. Why are you here? This makes no sense. Explain this to me. So I start telling him about the Jewish tradition of peace, and of human rights, of tikkun olam, and of justice. He says, for us Palestinians, there is no justice. And although we were still a few months away from our holiday of Hanukkah, where we, on the first night, at the darkest time of year, we light one candle, second night 2 candles, and so on and so forth. My answer to him was, when all is dark, you have to start by lighting that first candle. And by the way, 17 years ago, we lit a Hanukkah menorah in the rubble of a demolished home. And that was our commitment, that we would not rest until we had dispelled the darkness of demolitions with the light of hope and of justice. We did that again this year, saying we haven't forgotten. And if we don't win in court, we'll do something else. We won't give up. But what it's all is about is our Talmud has this amazing image, looking at all of life as 2 perfectly balanced scales. And we never know, on the personal or the cosmic level, what little act that we take seems meaningless, pointless, irrelevant, ineffective at the time, whether that will be the act that tips those scales one way or the other. And so my concluding hope and wish and prayer and blessing for all of us, whether it be the Middle East or any of the other spheres of our personal and public and spiritual lives. So we should always have the courage and the wisdom and the faith to tip the scales in the right direction. Thank you. Todah, shukran.